Michele Flournoy returns to ChinaTalk. We last did a show in March 2021. A lot's happened since then. Michele Flournoy has had a long career in the Pentagon, serving most recently as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President Obama. She has also founded WestExec Advisors and CNAS. Michele, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Thanks for having me back. A lot has happened.
So let's start off with a softball. What is an end game that the U.S. should aim for in its relationship with China?
Well, if that's the softball, I'm worried about the hardball. So, no, I think I actually think the administration has stated it fairly clearly that we are in a strategic competition, but the name of the game is managing the competition so it does not become conflict, and managing the competition such that in a way that allows us to cooperate in the areas where we have common interests, like, preventing further climate change or preventing further proliferation of nuclear weapons, those kinds of things. So the question is, how do we manage the competition in ways that, prevent conflict and leave room for cooperation? But much easier said than done, obviously. We're having a hard time achieving that.
Yeah. So talking about that sort of managing the competition dynamic, since Speaker of the House Pelosi visited Taiwan, there's been this move by the Chinese side basically to stop all conversation on anything as sort of like a precondition for the U.S. like being nicer to China. And you've seen some reporting recently of sanctions and entity listings that have been put on hold by the U.S., ostensibly according to Reuters, in order to give the Chinese an easier pathway to reopen these channels of communication. And sort of the main argument, or one of the arguments that the Biden administration is pushing forward, is this idea that crisis communication is really important, and like that's a thing that would stop World War III. So I guess my sort of question, to put like somewhat provocatively to you, as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about Able Archer and all of the close calls that have happened over the course of the Cold War, is like, I wonder how valuable that the sort of like pre-big crisis communication is, with thinking that like if there's a big crisis and the Chinese government wants to de-escalate, then like they'll probably pick up the phone then, even if they weren't in an earlier period where this is sort of used as more of a bargaining chip. I'm curious for your sort of like reflections on that tension there.
Well, I do think, just stepping back, I think right now both sides are concerned that the rhetoric and the tension is heated up to levels that neither side really wants right now. And so I think you're starting to see efforts at renewing some dialogue. Jake Sullivan's meeting, for example, talk of now cabinet members starting to meet with their counterparts. And I think we can expect to see some engagement between President Biden and Xi, either on the margin of upcoming meetings this fall or, specifically set up, calls set up and so forth. So I think both sides want to kind of ratchet down the tension. But this larger question of risk reduction measures and sort of crisis communications, it really is something we have tried, even when there was a lot of dialogue, back in the Obama administration, where we had this regular tempo of strategic and economic dialogues. And, I used to meet with my PLA counterpart twice a year and so forth. We tried to push the issue then because things like the hotline, things like incidents at sea agreement, these were mechanisms we put in place in the Cold War with the Soviets, with the understanding that if we have a crisis that's not deliberate or not, intended by at least one side, if it's truly an accident or a miscalculation, we need to have mechanisms for de-escalation and an understanding of how we'll communicate, protocols to de-escalate, and so forth. The Chinese have never been willing to talk about that, even in better times in the relationship. The two things they've said, in my hearing have been, number one, you seem to really, really want this. So if you really, really want this, we will give it to you only if you give it something to us that we really, really want. Like stop bothering us about Taiwan or stop talking about human rights. And of course, that's not going to happen. The other thing is I've heard Chinese interlocutors say, look, if we put risk reduction measures in place, that will create an environment where you're incentivized, you, the United States, are incentivized to adopt riskier behaviors because we have these protocols. So we don't want to do that. And so they just see it through a totally different lens. And so consequently, when the spy balloon incident happened, the U.S. was calling on the supposed hotline for days before anybody answered the phone.
I really hope it's like a literal thing, and there's just someone in the room being like, "No, not today."
Well, I think it's deeper than that. And it's unfortunate because, you mentioned the Pelosi visit, the McCarthy meeting with Tsai. In each of these instances, the reaction from the Chinese was to ratchet up the level of military activity around Taiwan and to the aggressiveness. And so we're now seeing very dangerous, sort of accident prone behavior from some aspects of the Chinese military that could very easily result in another P3 type of incident. Again, that is something that neither side wants right now.
So I guess the question then is like, even if back in 2010, when the dynamic was very different and the sort of PLA couldn't see its way around to these sort of crisis communications and, whatever procedures being in their interests, like, is it really worth the US continuing to try to make this a thing? And should America be like, I don't know, um, trading off other policy aims in order to
No, and
kind
I
of.
don't think the administration has traded anything off and or will. I mean, this is something that should be seen as in our interests in its own right. And so I think it doesn't hurt for the administration to keep saying, look, we think this is best practice. We think there's value in here. But I don't think they should trade off other objectives and interests for it. Sadly, I think the thing that will move the needle on this is if we actually have some crisis. And it scares both sides, realizing that we didn't have the proper frameworks and mechanisms to deal with it in the best way possible. And maybe that will move the needle. I'm not wishing for that, but I sadly think that that's what it'll take. It'll take something that really rattles the Chinese to make them realize we actually need to have these mechanisms in place.
So, talking about conceptualizing deterrence, there's a debate going around whether a sort of weak China or a strong China is more scary and more likely to plunge the world into catastrophe. We've done a number of shows on ChinaTalk exploring this idea of temporal claustrophobia, basically the idea of Japan in 1941 thinking about we might not have a great chance of creating a co-prosperity sphere if we start a war now, but it's going to be even worse in 1942 or 1943. And the same logic can be applied to, the Kaiser and Hitler when they've done crazy stuff. So I guess I'm curious sort of how you think about sort of Chinese national power trajectories and the risk of conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to focus on Xi as a leader to start. He's really moved from a collective leadership model to much more of a one-man rule consolidation of power. And it's very clear that he thinks the days of, hide and bide, don't mind us, we're just a developing nation. We don't have aggressive designs on anybody. Those days are over. And he's really wants to, see China fully arrive as a great power in Asia and on the world stage. I still believe that he prefers to address the Taiwan issue, which is the most likely flashpoint, through political and economic means, political coercion, influencing the Taiwan elections, economic envelopment and deepening of ties, shrinking Taiwan's international space to basically kind of put Taiwan in a position that they have no choice but to sort of accede to rejoining China in some way. But I also believe that he's made it clear that he wants to resolve this issue on his watch whether it's during an extraordinary third term or an even more extraordinary fourth term. But he doesn't want to wait till 2049 and the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a scenario in which he's frustrated that the non-military means have not worked. That he sees the U.S. posture growing stronger, which it will, and into the 2030s when a lot of our investments come to full fruition. And he judges that there's, if I don't try now, I may not have the opportunity to achieve this goal. And if you add to that, what we just saw with Putin and Ukraine, in an authoritarian system, you have this untested military, but who's probably not going to be speaking a lot of truth to power in terms of saying, "I'm sorry, President Xi, we're just not ready," or "We don't think we can win," or all those capabilities you've given us don't really give us confidence that we can actually seize this small island nearby. I mean, I just don't think he's going to get a very honest assessment from the PLA, which opens a lot of room for miscalculation.
So you mentioned this idea of 2030 and the investments kick in. How do you conceptually balance investing in near term versus longer term deterrence?
Well, I do. It is a balance, and there are some tough trade-offs. But I think the department is very much indexed on the 2030s modernization and investments, thinking and those judgments were made, 2 and 3 years ago. That's unfortunately our very slow budget cycle in defense. But, those judgments were made a while ago that we'd have that time and we could work on that time frame. I think more recently, we've gotten some indicators that she at least has accelerated a number of key military programs and has asked for, options to be ready in 2027. Does that mean he's going to launch a war in 2027? Of course not. But the fact that he wants to have options by then gives us a new objective, I think, which is we better be confident in our ability to deter by 2027. And that does require some different kinds of investments. Things like shoring up our munitions stockpiles. Things like really putting a number of the posture moves in place. For example, we've just been given access to 4 more areas of the Philippines, but currently there's no appropriated funds for that. So, how do we actually, use the time we have to develop those accesses? And there's a whole laundry list of things you can read through the Indo-PACOM Commander's unfunded priorities list for a good, encapsulation of that. But we have to do both. And we also have to make sure that not all of our senior leader bandwidth is consumed with the near fight, which is Ukraine. I mean, there's a huge amount of leader attention going to this very real threat to order and stability in the heart of Europe. So, it's a tough job. You got to be able to juggle lots of balls at once and make those hard trade-offs, but we can't completely neglect the near term and just hope that we aren't challenged until we're ready in the 30s.
So I recently read this book called The Social History of the Machine Gun, and it sort of tells the story of how the machine gun was ready basically by the 1870s and even into like 1915, 1916, like as you've already had tens of thousands of people killed by this gun on the western and eastern fronts of World War I, like folks still hadn't entirely wrapped their head around just how much these new guns have changed the nature of war. So I guess I'm curious, from a sort of abstract level, looking at 14 critical technologies and AI and biotech, as well as like what the U.S. can actually learn from staring at the war in Ukraine, like how we can do our best to make sure that whatever's the next machine gun isn't something that's America's prepared for and invested in.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is we have got to put some of our best and brightest on experimenting with new technologies and capabilities, developing new operational concepts, or in some cases, it's putting existing systems together in new ways that have a different, outcome. But that experimentation, concept development, it can't be a top-down, consensus-driven process. It has to be bottom-up, competitive, creative, innovative, um, uh, kind of a ferment of putting a lot of smart people on some really tough operational problems and giving them, encouraging them to come up with alternative ways to solve those problems using some of these new tools. So there's that piece of it. But then, even when you have success in that, you still have the famous valley of death. If I win a prototype contest today, I will not have a chance to be in production until the FY26 program. So that's a problem. That lag time is a real problem, and I think we have to do a better job, both using the authorities the department already has to bridge accelerate the scaling of those things, but also probably need some new bridge funding from the Congress to enable that acceleration in some cases. So this is a problem. The last thing I'll say on the budget is, the budget's already occupied with legacy systems that have large constituencies connected to jobs in congressional districts and so forth. And so you have something really great. It's disruptive. The leadership wants it, but trying to find room in the budget, what do you cut, without Congress basically reversing whatever new thing you put in. The politics of it are very difficult as well.
Why can't there be just like, okay, we'll cut this thing, it costs you 1,000 jobs. Like, why don't we just like give you 1,000 jobs that are way cheaper than the, $10 billion that you're getting for these other 1,000 jobs that are making this tank that no one wants anymore?
It's a good thought, and I think sometimes when there's been success, it has been, when the department's been able to offer an alternative in the same district and employing some of the same workers. But sometimes that shift just doesn't work. It's a software-defined system rather than a hardware manufactured system or whatever. So, but I think you have to get down to the brass tacks of understanding the politics and putting together new coalitions of supporters for some of these more disruptive technologies.
So let's come back to this idea you talked to earlier of this sort of like taking existing capabilities and rejiggering them in new ways in a sort of competitive environment that is obviously happening now in Ukraine. I just read an article earlier this morning, this long, fantastically reported piece in the New Yorker of this reporter who spent 2 weeks on the front lines of Bakhmut. And, they're literally have both Maxim guns as well as drones that have grenades on them that are being dropped, that are sort of like finding the enemy and then like dropping ordnance on them from, 50 feet up in the air. But, that sort of innovation, it happens because lives are on the line, and there is like a sort of horrifically competitive process where the people who don't innovate sort of tactically or operationally, to what extent can the U.S. both learn from that as well as try to bring in some more lean to the extent that it's possible into the more wartime pace of innovation and operations, which is being shown in Ukraine?
Yeah. No, I think we are. I think there's an effort to learn a lot of lessons by seeing how the Ukrainians are innovating. As the old phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, as you say, lives are on the line. It's a pretty strong motivating factor to figure out how you can be more effective with what you have in hand. And they've been incredibly creative and fast with how they've evolved things. But they've also been really good at bringing in commercial technologies that they can grab off the shelf and modifying them and using those, whether it's Starlink for command and control communications or these little commercial drones that they've strapped ordnance onto and managed to turn them into weapons. So I do think we have a lot to learn from that. And again, I think part of this is in, encouraging and incentivizing the services to create sort of teams that could mix both military systems and commercial systems in new ways to take on specific priority operational problems and to really experiment with that. It's interesting. One of the parts of the military that does this best is within SOCOM and within SOCOM JSOC, because they are in this weird hybrid situation of being both a COCOM but also having authorities to organize, train, and equip like a service. And so they will take hard problems and give people a challenge, and they'll go out to industry, defense, and commercial, and they'll say, come on, show us what you got. And they'll experiment with these things and get them fielded within a pretty, short timeline. Now, we need more of that kind of agility and innovation across the services, but it needs to be driven from the top and incented more than it's been to date.
SOCOM, of course, I mean, they've been in this, they have been fighting for 20 years, right? Yeah. So it's I guess harder and easier to move things fast when if you don't, people die. Yeah. So the idea of like cultural or sort of like cultural and social change connected to big platforms that have like perhaps outlived their usefulness. Another book for you, Flying Camelot, which sort of tells the story of the Air Force and Boyd and the sort of the fighter jet mafia, which was sort of enamored with World War I, duels in the sky, and like ended up probably taking it a little too far into the 80s and 90s, because they sort of saw this, one type of warfare as being like the I don't know, like the greatest achievement or like peak of humanity, and that sort of attachment to fighter jet dogfights ended up blinding them to larger technological changes and evolving strategic realities. Thoughts or reflections on that on that narrative, where you're worried that might still be in effect in certain weapon systems, and how you kind of incentivize large organizations to perhaps like divorce themselves from the specific weapons platforms and think more holistically about future missions?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly cultural barriers that inhibit change. People get very enamored of a certain way of war or a certain set of capabilities, and they really don't want to be disrupted because they've spent their whole careers perfecting operations in a given area. But I actually do think that, I see signs that at least at their very top, there's the leadership. And if you take the Air Force, it's no longer a fighter-dominated culture. I mean, we still have there's still a lot of fighter pilots, and they're still in the leadership ranks. But look at the amount of investment they put into bombers, new strategic bombers, rethinking not only the nuclear mission, but how bombers can be used in a theater where we need to buy back range, and even in a tactical fight vis-a-vis China over Taiwan, for example. And in addition, they're also thinking about how do you take those fighters that may still be range challenged and pair them or connect them with swarms of unmanned systems that can go forward. They can direct and control and go forward beyond the range of the fire into the kill zone and have devastating effects. So I do see signs. It's very uneven across the services, but I do see signs that the services are really digesting that, deterring China, operating against China if it came to that, in a maritime environment with great distances where you're going to be contested in every domain, from space to cyber to air to on the surface, under the water, etc. That they are starting to rethink this. And it's not just dismissing legacy systems. It's really realizing that a lot of your legacy systems are bought and paid for. They're in your force now, and they're going to be with us for a while. So it's how do you marry those with new capabilities that will create different effects. So taking that short-legged fighter that can't necessarily reach all the targets you want, with confidence, but making it more resilient and relevant by putting longer range munitions on it, pairing it with swarms of drones, linking it to space-based C2, all of that. So it's really how do we give some of these systems that are going to be with us for a while new life by integrating them with more disruptive technologies that are coming online.
So speaking of investing a lot of time into a skill which may no longer be relevant, have you been playing a lot with ChatGPT over the past few months?
Not a lot, a little bit of experimentation, but you know, certainly tracking the issue. I haven't
Okay.
spent a huge amount of time having it write my talking points and memos yet.
So Michelle, you mentioned recently that you were interested in exploring how AI can, support and supplement humans as they make decisions. Where in particular are you excited to see that dynamic play out?
So, very excited in a couple of areas. One is what I would call predictive intelligence. So, you know, when you're in a policymaking position, the world is awash in intelligence, and there's also all kinds of open source information. It's information overload. Having some, if you're watching, if you're a combatant commander, for example, and you're watching developments in your region, if you can have a tool that looks at all of these inputs and recognizes patterns that suggests that an event may be coming, that can be really useful, kind of separating the wheat from the chaff, giving you insight. And I'll give an example that I read about. It was in the press, so can be noted. The Chinese are doing a lot of maneuvering in space, trying to get a closer look at some of our most sensitive military satellites. And it used to be that, people watching what was happening in space might have a couple of days' notice that one of these proximity operations was about to occur. Well, the Space Force and Spacecom and Stratcom have been experimenting with some AI-based tools. And the tool that they were using gave them over 50 days of warning that this was coming because it had analyzed all of the preparatory, actions that this other country had taken in previous instances, and it saw those happening way before the few days when you could see the maneuvering happening. So that is really helpful for decision makers to have more time to think about options to prevent or deter or respond. That's one thing. Similarly, maintenance. There's now AI being used for predictive maintenance. So again, looking at patterns of what's happening in a system and seeing the early indicators that a part is going to fail before it fits or need replacement before something catastrophic happens. That can be very helpful and also very, reduce cost a great deal. So those are just a couple of examples. But I think, and the other one is we already talked about human machine teaming. There's a certain amount of AI that's required to give one pilot a swarm of 100 drones that they can control and direct.
Yeah, you mentioned this idea of predictive maintenance. There was in this sort of New Yorker Ukraine article, they talked about PTSD, and the sort of challenges you inevitably go through in suffering multiple concussions and living with your life in the hands of randomness for days, weeks, months on end. I wonder if there's something sort of like what NBA teams do with their players, where it's like, okay, like if you had enough stress, your injury risk goes up, and so you should maybe not practice this hard or take a rest day or two off. If there's something in the psychology of if there's enough data, I mean, there must be like enough data that humans push off to give you some sort of like predictive mechanism for the mental health challenges that a company
You know,
combat.
I think almost all of the services and the special operations community have resiliency programs where they try to kind of fortify people with various tools, offering various tools and techniques to kind of build both mental and physical resilience. But I'm not aware of any program that is kind of tracking their specific metrics in real time, day to day, to make those judgment calls of, hey, today's a good day for you to take a rest day from, working out or, your physical fitness stuff, or hey, this is a soldier who actually needs some time off before he's sent back out into the battlefield. There's such a taboo against sort of not being ready and available when your unit's going forward that I think, I just haven't seen a system that is tracking it at that level, but I think it theoretically could be possible, going with some of the tools that are available.
All right. Well, future startup
Idea,
founder
yes.
to create this, if you
Not
want.
for equity in that if you figure it out.
It's interesting thinking about the stigma, right? Because like maybe if it is just a number and it's like connected to your heart rate variability or how you sleep or this, that, and the other thing, it might make it a little easier to sort of take that preventative action.
If everybody was going through it, yeah, absolutely, and it was just sort of this is the way it's done. I think the hardest thing, the thing we're seeing right now is a real continued crisis with service member suicides, and there's still a great stigma against seeking mental health help. Seeking help when you need it, and so you do see various communities trying to innovate in how that help is provided. I've been involved with one group called Sound Off, which is basically anonymous counseling support. So it's not a one-off hotline. You get a consistent counseling relationship with a therapist, but you can remain anonymous, like first name basis or, camera off on Zoom or what have you. And some of the communities are embracing this because everything else just hasn't worked, and people need the anonymity to feel safe to seek the help, which is something we should try to change. But in the meantime, if that is the case, you got to find other ways to get the people the help they need
sure.
when they need it in a crisis.
I'm particularly excited about the ChatGPT therapists for everybody, which is
that could be a little dangerous.
Look, it's like there's like 4. I read this somewhere. It's like 4 psychologists for every 100,000 people. I mean, it's not a like one-on-one therapy is not a functional, scalable thing. So I don't know. We'll see. So coming back to AI, OpenAI just put out a blog post on the heels of their CEO Sam Altman's testimony in Congress, saying basically putting across the transom the idea that, quote, we need some degree of cooperation among the leading development efforts to ensure the development of superintelligence occurs in a manner that allows us to both maintain safety and help smooth integration of these systems with society, as well as proposition that, quote, we are likely to eventually need something like an IAEA for superintelligence efforts, with any effort above a certain capability having, being subject to international authority, just like it, would be for making a nuclear bomb. I'm curious the idea of sort of nuclear arms control analogies to artificial general intelligence, like what does and doesn't make sense when trying to draw that line.
Well, I think regulating AI is much harder, but I liked, I thought Sam's call for, we need to create our own sort of ethical standards and eventually some regulatory mechanism within the United States. But then that's not enough. We're going to have to work this at the international level to make sure there are at least common norms, if not actual, standards and oversight. The hardest thing is, the AI is unlike a set of nuclear weapons. It's not easily observable. It's not, in many cases, still not very explainable. There's a lot of very sophisticated AI tools that are kind of a black box even to the developers. They know they work, but they don't know why or how they work, and they don't really know what the negative potential second and third order deviations can be. So I think he's on the right track. I don't know that an IAEA is exactly the right model, but I do think we need to have both domestic set of standards and regulation, and then also international, because right now it's just the Wild West. This, the economic incentives for U.S. companies right now is just get whatever you have out the door as quickly as possible, so you don't lose market share and you don't lose reputation and brand, even if it hasn't been fully tested and you're not fully comfortable that you know how it works and that the safety measures are in place. That is not a good dynamic, right? We need to, counter that with some sense of, ethics and norms and standards. And then same at the, the international level. Whether or not a China or a Russia would abide by those standards is an open question, but I think having them as a normative basis for then building coalitions around that in response to bad behavior or bad, or irresponsible uses of AI, I think that's a good start.
Maybe we should give the AI community a little nuclear history lesson, Michele. How I think there's this sort of misunderstanding in the community that the sort of nuclear race between the US and the Soviet Union was a static one, when in fact it was very dynamic, and arms control kind of happened only a few times, and then only under very sort of short anyways. Well, why don't you do the history lesson?
I mean, there were some very dangerous moments in the Cold War, both obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also accidents, accidents that could have resulted in a nuclear exchange. So there was a lot of there was a bit of a Wild West dynamic early, until things stabilized into a more sort of well understood by both sides deterrence framework, although even there was room for miscalculation. So you're right. In the early days, it was not stable. It was not the two sides didn't understand that we had very different doctrines, very different views, didn't understand each other very well, weren't communicating much. So I think the early period, sort of up until and maybe even through the Cuban Missile Crisis, was probably the more relevant comparison to where we are today.
Yeah, because I think this is where the analogy, that 1945 to maybe 1970 dynamic is particularly apt here, because the technology is changing so fast. And that was the same with nuclear weapons. All of a sudden hydrogen bombs were a thing. All of a sudden ICBMs were a thing. And there was both sides were spending enormous amounts of sort of intellectual capital, money, and sort of strategic thought on trying to think through just how useful or not useful these weapons are under different contexts. And we're in such early days with artificial intelligence, and the sort of capabilities are developing so fast that I'm a little worried of swinging too far the other way, where I think actually there's an aspect of having firms compete to make better tech is a net positive, in that you don't necessarily fall behind in the sort of overall capability dimension. But the idea that two countries, you can make a simple model, and two countries both have 100 nuclear weapons and can kill the other population, so then we should all sit down and see how we can get to 50 and 10 and 5, seems very far away from the moment that we're in now with artificial intelligence, where every 2 weeks there's some crazy new breakthrough about what this stuff can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the early period, sort of up until and maybe even through the Cuban Missile Crisis, was probably the more relevant comparison to where we are today. which is again why I think has some sense of, where the guardrails are, what we will, what it is acceptable versus not, what needs additional oversight versus not. These are key questions. And, I think, we were talking about DoD before. I think the department has done a pretty good job of setting down some guidelines for its own application of AI that enforce, ensuring that we have human judgment in the loop, which is really critical. Now, again, the whole question of what do we do when our adversaries don't abide by those ethics is a big challenge. But I think right now the guidelines within defense are pretty clear, but it could be an interesting thing on which to build a more national set of standards and even inject that into the international discussion too.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of thinking about if and when, whatever guardrails you decide to put around a technology end up becoming a competitive disadvantage, and whether, the trade-off in terms of whatever norm you're trying to set ends up being worth it. And, you can apply this to cluster munitions or lots of other technologies, not just artificial intelligence.
That's true.
How should history have I guess we've kind of made the case for having history have a seat at the table. But you mentioned in an interview recently with a former CIA official that you oftentimes in high level policy deliberations wished that there was more sort of historical context being placed at the placed in the briefing books that you'll in 2030 just have ChatGPT summarize for you. But I guess I'm curious, like if you've done any more thinking on that, like in terms of a organizational structure or books that you think have sort of you've come back to that offer a really good idea, a good framework of applying history to contemporary events.
I think to be fair, I think the intelligence community does a reasonably good job of providing historical context, understanding a country or, a region and that kind of thing. But what I was talking about, the specific example I gave was, historical cases of counterinsurgency, and under which there haven't been that many, but under what conditions have they succeeded? Under what conditions have they failed, and sort of coming up with some set of guideposts to judge whether a counterinsurgency approach would work in Afghanistan, for example, and only under these conditions. And if these conditions are true, great. If they're not going to be true, like for example, most counterinsurgencies have taken more than a decade to succeed. And, if the president is not willing to, surge forces for a decade, then maybe you should think about another strategy. I just felt like we had a lot of discussion of the contemporary situation, but I wished that there was some historical analysis brought to the table. And it was nobody's job to really do that, because the intelligence community is very loath to enter into the discussion of U.S. options and what U.S. options might be better or worse, because that brings them into policymaking. And so it's a gap. Whether you want to create a White House historian's office or, a special senior advisory group of historians that, the president can call in for specific questions that inform the discussion. I don't know how you'd structure it. I know a lot of presidents. President Obama was an avid reader of history and used to invite various historians to have dinner with him in the White House and pick their brains. But it is, culturally, Americans love to put the past in their rearview mirror and not think, and we're just moving forward. And if we have the right intent and, and the can-do spirit, we can do anything. Well, some problems in the world just aren't subject to that approach. They're more fundamental, historical and cultural things that need to be considered. So anyway, to me, that was one of the lessons learned from the experience in Afghanistan, that somehow we need to give more voice from history. Not that it's a single voice, people will have different interpretations, but we need to have that to be part of the debate.
All right. Last one for you. So, you were part of creating a sort of new intellectual institution to inform national security decision making. I'm curious, um, why when you founded CNAS, did you think the world needed another think tank back then? And going forward, I guess you sort of laid out the vision for one of sort of thinking about bringing more history into discussions. But if you have any other ideas or like dreams for approaches that you'd hope a new think tank type organization could take on.
Yeah, no, I think that, most people thought that Kurt Campbell and I were crazy to try to start another think tank and tried to dissuade us. We were fortunate that a few people like, Bill Perry and Madeleine Albright and Rich Armitage and, um, you know, John Podesta and others believed in the concept. But what we were trying to do differently is, number one, at the time, bipartisan think tanks were bipartisan only in the most careful sense, meaning you would have Republicans and Democrats on your board, but you'd really try not to offend anybody. And we sort of thought there was, height of the Iraq War, whether you were for the war or against the war, we needed a strategy for trying to end the war responsibly, meeting our objectives to the extent it was possible. And that we had to go to that pain point because it was so consequential. Whereas a lot of other think tanks, it was like, oh, that's too controversial, can't do that. The second thing is realizing that think tanks produce not only intellectual capital and great reports for policymakers to think over the horizon or more strategically about an issue, but one of the main products of think tanks is the people. And then what if we had a think tank that was really focused on developing the next generation of national security professionals as part of the mission and as part of the day-to-day focus? And that was a key differentiation for CNAS at the time. And we had the Next Gen Fellows program and all of that, which has now been copied by just about every other think tank, which is great because you can't have too many of these programs, and imitation is the best form of flattery, isn't that the phrase? We're all very flattered that everybody else has a Next Gen program now, which is great. So there was room for another think tank. CNS is now celebrating its 15th anniversary and has been very impactful, especially when you consider it's small but mighty.
As someone who's interacted a lot, particularly with the junior staff over the past 5 years, I can say, and maybe I'll take this off the show, just like I see folks coming in to all these different organizations who do China stuff because like young people like ChinaTalk or whatever, and like the amount of intellectual development that I see from the CNAS 23, 25-year-olds after 2 years versus someone who's just like a research assistant for one person at Brookings. It's like really remarkable because they're just as smart going in, right? I don't think it's necessarily picking folks to begin with. It's just like you just get treated like an adult.
Well, I think you owe your listeners that insight. So,
well, I don't want to be so mean to the other place. Anyway, all right. So last thing, coming back to the sort of second part of the question, are there other I don't know, dynamics that you think a think tank should try to explore or take on now?
Well, I do think this question of, back to ChinaTalk, really trying to understand the Chinese calculus and particularly the Chinese leadership calculus, because we forget that over the course of the Cold War, a whole cottage industry of people who really tried to understand the Soviet mindset and calculus and how it differed from ours, that grew up, and it was exceedingly helpful to inform policy. We don't have that same depth in terms of dedicated folks across think tank land, FFRDCs, academic institutions, government, that is really helping us understand how she will make a calculation, like whether to invade Taiwan. And I think that if an invasion of Taiwan occurs under circumstances in which the U.S. will respond, we should be very honest. We're in World War III involving two nuclear powers. So we should all be leaning into doing everything possible to try to prevent that. And that includes developing the human capital to really provide true expertise and help American policymakers understand how their Chinese counterparts think, which I'm presuming may be somewhat differently than how we might think in a similar situation.
You are preaching to the choir here. I've spent a fair amount of time actually reading about Sovietology. There's this great book called Know Your Enemy. I did an interview with the author, and the story was in the 40s and 50s. The Ford Foundation and Carnegie Corporation put up like $50 million, and then the Air Force, because they were the hip new branch and they were doing all this fun stuff with Rand. They had this big research effort where they interviewed all the Soviet emigres. Ostensibly, the idea was to, can we learn about Soviet society for us to come up with more creative ideas to bomb. So if we bomb this, not that, then maybe we'll have a we'll end up figuring out how to break their society down. But what it really ended up doing is training hundreds and hundreds of people how to speak Russian, because they just hung out with all these emigres and or sort of folks who've folks who were caught on the wrong side, or I guess kind of the right side after the fighting stopped in World War II, and that hasn't happened yet, and it's 2023. You have these little efforts like the China House in the State Department and the China Mission Center in the CIA. But just from my little vantage point of talking to young people who are really passionate and interested in China and have invested in language skills or are heritage speakers and want to want to think about these issues, it's really upsetting how scarce job opportunities are to think deeply about these sorts of war and peace type questions, which it's not even an ounce of investment gives a pound of prevention, because people are so cheap, compared to literally one fewer fighter jet could create an entire industry of really great scholarship on China, and it breaks my heart to see people who want to do this and end up taking different paths because the jobs aren't there for them. On this idea of CNAS and bipartisanship, as China is sort of continuing to be the one thing Republicans and Democrats can agree on, I'm curious, your thoughts on the prospects of that, how that can be channeled in a more or less useful way.
I think the growing consensus across the aisle, Democrat, Republican, and independents, on the China threat or the China challenge, I would love to see that become the basis for new consensus on some of the ways in which we need to invest in the drivers of our own competitiveness. So, for example, immigration policy, probably the third rail of politics right now, one of the third rails. You just don't go there. You can not assume any consensus whatsoever. But if you say, look, we need to open up the channels for science and technology, STEM talent to come in from around the world, attract the best and brightest, incentivize them to stay, make their lives here, build their businesses here with the appropriate security vetting. That is blood in the bloodstream of our innovation ecosystem. If you look at the founders in Silicon Valley, half of them are either immigrants or first-generation Americans. Same is true for STEM talent in defense industry. So we're hurting ourselves when we don't figure out how to give easy visas to people who want to come here for graduate schools, and then help them have a fast track if they're highly qualified STEM talent to green card and citizenship, again, with appropriate vetting. That's I would love to see that consensus on the China threat move into that aspect of immigration policy. Another one, trade policy. The biggest own goal, the biggest way that we hurt ourselves in Asia vis-a-vis China was not joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we negotiated, architected as a high standards agreement, all of our allies and partners in there. Now China wants to get in there. Could we come, based on the China consensus that's emerging, could we re-examine that through the lens of competing with China as opposed to some ideology, about, is free trade good or bad and so forth. So the question I have is, can you take the agreement around the threat and move it into some of these areas that would be really strategic for us as a nation if we could come together, much as we had come together on things like investing in CHIPS Act and, onshoring some of our semiconductor industry.
Thank you so much for being a part of China.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Wait a minute, let me tell you a little something about the money, honey. All right. Well, I'd be doggone if I wouldn't work all day, baby. And I'd be doggone if I wouldn't bring you my pay, baby. But if I ever caught you running around, throwing my money all over this town, then I wouldn't be doggone. Hey, I'd be long gone. I wouldn't be doggone, baby. I'd be long gone. Now, hey, I'd be doggone if you ain't a pretty thing, baby. And I'd be doggone if you ain't warm as a breath of spring, oh baby. And if we live to be 100 years old, and if you ever let that spring turn cold, then I wouldn't be doggone. Hey, I'd be long gone. Be what? I wouldn't be doggone, baby. I'd be long gone. Let me tell you that. Now would you hear me?
I want to tell you about this.
Well, now what I say?
What I say? I want some money that. A lot of money. I want some money that.
That's what I want. Well, every woman should try to be whatever her man wants her to be. And I don't want much, all I want from you is for you to be true to me. I'll be doggone if love ain't a man's best friend, baby. And I'll be doggone if you ain't the loving end, oh baby. Though I know you make me feel like nobody could if I ever